Michelangelo. Various people are so famous, they're only known by one name. Take historical figures such as Hitler, Stalin, or even artistic figures such as Raphael, or Michelangelo, arguably one of the most prolific sculptors and painters and even poets of the 16th century, and his name really exemplifies what was so special about the Renaissance. In other words, if Il Divino Michelangelo were still alive today, he would easily be considered an A-list celebrity and praised for many of his artistic talents. So, before we begin this lecture, we will be talking about the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. What is the Renaissance? Then we will be talking about Michelangelo, when he was born, his early life, and his rise to fame. And then we're gonna take an in-depth look into humanism and secularism, which is very much present in Michelangelo's art.
As we go on with this presentation, there are a couple of key questions we might want to consider to better understand Michelangelo's work. Primarily, how did Michelangelo become an emblematic figure of the Renaissance? Next, how did the Renaissance give birth to the modern man? If so, what is the modern man? Did individualism make its first appearance during the Renaissance? Was humanism the hallmark of this period of rebirth? Does he have comments on political structures and individual participation? Here are some fun facts about Michelangelo. He was first seen as a sculptor, but was most known for his paintings of the Sistine Chapel in Rome. He only signed one of his artworks, the Pieta. He once made a sculpture out of snow to entertain the wealthy. He was one of the leading architects responsible for the reconstruction of St. Peter's in Rome, from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance. So first, let's discuss what the Renaissance is. So the Renaissance is a French term which means rebirth. It is a time period that follows the Middle Ages and describes the changes in European art and culture between the 15th and 16th century. This artistic movement originated in Florence, the city with the most artistic activity, and represented artistic individuality, rediscovery of ancient cultures such as the Greek and Roman cultures, and gave birth to the notion of humanism, which was a notion that put forth humans and their abilities. The Renaissance is also characterized as a period of geographical discovery and scientific inquiry. It also introduced the concept of perspective into a painting and how artists would depict the three-dimensional world onto a two-dimensional canvas. Even though this movement is mainly an artistically driven campaign, historians were able to divide the Renaissance into three periods: the early Renaissance, the high Renaissance, which is the period where Michelangelo was born, and the late Renaissance.
A prodigy was born. Michelangelo di Lodovico Buonarrota was born March 6, 1475, in Caprese, which is a small town located 40 miles away from Florence. His parents were Lodovico Buonarrota Simoni and Francesca del Neri. He was the second child of 5 kids and was born into a minor aristocrat family. But before his birth, his father received a job opportunity as a governor of Caprese and Chiusi. Both parents made the long journey, with Leonardo, the first child of the family, who was 18 months at the time. The trip was made even more difficult because Francesca was pregnant to Michelangelo. After a long journey, they found a home in Caprese where they would stay for 6 months only, and Michelangelo was later born. After a 6-month stay, the family moved back to Florence, but Francesca was too weak and frail to nurse Michelangelo, so he was sent to Settignano, where he was welcomed by a wet nurse. He would rarely go see his family, and by the time he turned 6 years old, his mother passed away. A couple of years after his mother's death, he went with his family and attended a school on a regular basis. But he did not enjoy school. Most of the time he skipped classes to learn the art of stone cutting in Settignano. Although through the years he picked up on Latin and Greek, his heart was set on art, and he spent many of his hours trying to copy figures from paintings and sculptures. Michelangelo was lucky he was good friends with Francesco Granacci, who had previously apprenticed with famous painter Domenico Ghirlandaio, where he begged his father if he could sign him up for an apprenticeship, but his father ultimately refused. In the end, Michelangelo dropped out of school and signed up for an apprenticeship in the workshop of Ghirlandaio. He was finally accepted and was introduced to the world of the arts. During the summer of 1489, Ghirlandaio had selected Michelangelo to be an intern for the famous sculptor Bertoldo di Giovanni. While he was interning there, he was discovered by Lorenzo de' Medici and invited to live as his protege. Rise to fame. Early works. In the year of 1491, Michelangelo created his first plaque, which was entitled Madonna of the Stairs. This early work of his really demonstrated an astonishing mastery of the delicate marble technique of the 15th century, but a lack of detail showed that it was a work of a rookie painter. 1 year after that, he created the Battle of the Centaurs, which was a small marble plaque that depicts a Roman battle scene. It is believed that this piece was one that Michelangelo felt a long life attachment to, and it is claimed that he kept it on the walls of his studio throughout his career. But sadly, on April 8, 1492, Lorenzo passed away and Michelangelo was forced to return to his family. During his stay at his family's house, he received an invitation from the monastery of Santo Spirito to observe a dissection of corpse and anatomy of the human body. His stay influenced him to create a wooden carving entitled Crucifix, which features the body of the Christ in a contrapposa pose. But those were Michelangelo's early works. His best was yet to come. In 1499, his sculpture Pieta marked a turning point in his career. The Pieta depicts the Virgin Mary holding the body of the Christ on her knees after he is brought down from the cross. This sculpture invites us to contemplate the Christ's sacrifices rather than feel sadness. Michelangelo's incredible use of detail in the modeling of the Christ's body transfers the warmth of the Virgin Mary's hands onto the cold marble. This really creates the impression that the Christ is sleeping rather than laying on her knees, lifeless. Now, even though the Pieta may have marked a turning point in Michelangelo's career, it was not his biggest sculpture. In fact, the creation of David established him as the greatest living sculptor in Italy, and it dethroned Donatello's famous yet boyish version of David. Michelangelo's sensual version of the Old Testament hero really represents the ideal youthful hero. For those of you who don't know the story of David and Goliath, David defeats Goliath, a very big man who is feared by all Israelites except for David. He is able to defeat him with his slingshot and a stone. But this sculpture did not stop Michelangelo from continuing his artistic genius. In 1508, Michelangelo began one of his biggest projects yet, the Sistine Chapel. Michelangelo did not feel as comfortable to do the job since he really considered himself a sculptor rather than a fresco painter. Initially, the plan was to paint only the areas between the arches, but Michelangelo really argued that something bigger was needed. The central areas of the ceiling featured 9 scenes from the book of Genesis, which were divided into 3: God's creation of the universe. Next was Adam and Eve and their expulsion from paradise, and the final was the sacrifice of Noah and the flood. These central scenes were surrounded by frescoes of prophets and sibyls, but unlike the legend states, Michelangelo did not work alone on this colossal project. He had a team of contractors, painters, and other people that helped him. In this bigger-than-life fresco, he uses a very thin and translucent watercolor, like paint, which resulted in an extremely luminous scene and surface. Secularism and humanism in Michelangelo's art. So, before we discuss and take an in-depth look at secularism and humanism and how it's presented in Michelangelo's work, first let's define these two notions. So secularism is really a belief that rejects religion, or the belief that religion should not be part of the state or public education. And humanism really is the belief that all people are good and that problems can be solved without religion and instead can be solved using reason. Both of these notions are really present in Michelangelo's art. These notions became very popular during the Renaissance because people believed that not only God created Earth, but that man could do great things that others can't do. The character of David and what he represents goes perfectly with Michelangelo's patriotic beliefs. During the time of the creation of the sculpture, the people of Florence had to be in permanent alert and always be ready to face permanent threats. Through the figure of David, Michelangelo really wishes to set a standard for heroic courage and hopes that the statue would inspire the people of Florence. We can see there's a lot of tension thanks to his look and his right hand, which is holding a stone. Not only does it represent humanism, but it also represents individualism because it depicted the perfect body and the perfect mind. Thanks to the look on his face, we can see he is really concentrated and thinking of a rational way to defeat Goliath. We know that he is not going to fight Goliath in a brutish manner, but instead he will use his intelligence, skill, and reason. The meaning of David becomes very clear once we take into consideration the historical circumstances of the creation of the art piece. We know that Michelangelo really was devoted to the Republic and wanted each citizen to become aware of his responsibilities and commit himself to accomplish his duties and become independent and self-reliant. So let's go back to the questions that we asked ourselves in the beginning of this lecture.
How did Michelangelo become an emblematic figure of the Renaissance? Well, as one of the most famous artists of the high to late Renaissance, he mainly viewed himself as a sculptor, but the frescoes made him gain equal recognition. His considerable talents also touched on the fields of architecture and poetry. His works of incredible quality and scale continue to exert great influences on art and culture of the modern days. He did not confine himself to sculpting or painting for the church and put forth individualism, how everyone should be self-reliant, humanism, and secularism. He also adopted unique techniques in his paintings and sculptures that made the piece stand out.
How did the Renaissance give birth to the modern man? And if so, what is the modern man? And did individualism make its first appearance during the Renaissance? We know that thanks to Michelangelo's massive depiction of the Old Testament giant slayer, that is, David, the modern man was depicted as a man who used reason to overcome perilous tasks and was shown as an athletic, beefy, and sensual, intelligent person. He used this masterpiece to arouse courage to the Florentines in hopes that they would understand his message and become self-reliant them as well. He really advocates for individualism, which was a movement that had just become famous and mainly appeared at the beginning of the Renaissance. To go back to the last question, was humanism the hallmark of this period of rebirth? And does it have comments on political structures and individual participation? It can reasonably be inferred that humanism is definitely the hallmark of Renaissance. It really represents the Renaissance, and it was a very present notion in Michelangelo's art. We see it really dominates the David sculpture, and it really gave people hope and made people use their reason and rely on their abilities to overcome tasks. We know that Michelangelo really was devoted to the Republic and wanted each citizen to become aware of their responsibilities and commit themselves to accomplishing their duties and becoming independent and self-reliant, and we can see that through his art piece, David. Well, we hope that you enjoyed this lecture. Tune in.